Okay, time to build our next app. This one we're going to be using Flickr. Now, Flickr is an image sharing website that is now owned by Yahoo, and there's basically billions or millions or countless images on there. So we're going to develop an app that will enable the user to search through Flickr using specific tags and show the results of that search, both the images and details about them, such as the author and a link and those sorts of things. So let's get started. So first things first, here's Flickr. If you haven't seen it before, you can see here there's an option search billions of photos. So we can just type in something, Android lollipop, press enter, and it gives us lots of photos. So it gives people the ability to upload photos and, as you saw in that search there, billions of photos online. So now owned by Yahoo. So what we're going to do is use the API from Flickr and try and get some images downloaded to our application. So they have got a lot of APIs, actually, more than one. So if we have a look, we go to flickr.com, services API. It's quite overwhelming when you first come here. This is all the different activities and so forth, authentication. We're scrolling down, there's a ton of information here. But what we're going to do is keep it pretty simple. We're going to use one of their public services. Now, the reason we're going to do that is it doesn't require authentication. Some of the other sort of more advanced APIs need an API key, which, as we saw in previous apps that we've created, we were able to get a Google API key. So we could certainly do that, but we're just going to keep this simple. We're going to use a public feed. Okay, so let's go to the public feed, and the public feed is available at services feeds. And there will be links in this section if you need to find out which links are which. They'll all be available. So you can see here that this is a general feed. Provides a number of data feeds in a variety of formats. And what we're going to do is just go down and have a bit of a look and use some of the most popular ones. And you can see here looking down, there's lots of different formats and even different languages that we can choose as well. So we're going to keep it pretty simple. We're going to go for public photos and video. And looking at that, that tells us, it returns a list of public content matching some criteria, but we've got the option for tags. So we can, in other words, we can filter the feed, so we can effectively search it and only return photos that match certain criteria. And we've even got the ability to search to sort of have multiple tags and only return images that have got all those tags attached to it or some. And we can also choose the type of the format. And incidentally, for tags, in case you're wondering, when people upload images to Flickr, they put tags, they associate tags to that image. So, for example, if you're uploading a photo about Android lollipop, you might add the tags Android lollipop, so that when people are searching, they can find your images. So that's what this section here is. Tags is going to be used. We're going to be using that to search for images that match a certain criteria. So probably the best thing to do to start off with is we're going to try this feed out. So let's just copy that, because that's a URL. We should be able to paste that straight into our browser. Paste that in. And you can see straight away we've got some data here, and there's a list of images essentially coming straight out of Flickr. So scrolling down, there's quite a few there. And that's probably not in the format we want it yet. But the interesting thing is if I refresh this, we're getting different photos. And that's because people are using this service continually. It's continually being updated, and you're always going to be getting, almost certainly going to be getting separate photos. Okay, now we have a look at the source code. So I'm going to right click that and view page source. Now we looked at this in a previous app. You can see that this is clearly XML. This is XML format, which we did before in our top 10 apps download. Recall that we actually wrote an XML parser to sort of extract the data into a format that we could use. So we're not going to do that this time. We're going to use another format. But before we go any further, let's just see if we can figure this out. Because I've got these parameters, so let's just try out some of these parameters just to try and make sure we can get this to work. And this is what I recommend you do when you are testing an API using a variety of formats, XML, Json, and other formats, is you test it out first in your browser. So you can see here it's got some parameters, and what they mean by query search parameters, they means that we can add that word to our list, to our URL, I should say. So what we can do is we can add parameters to this URL to sort of filter the results. So we saw in that example before, we can add tags, the word tags, but to start off, to add something, to add our parameters, the very first parameter has to have a question mark at the end of it. So we put tags equal, then we can do something like Android. So we should be able to do that. And we should now find that our photos should have something to do with Android. So it should be the tags, or there'll be something, the word Android will be used somewhere. You can see there, Android. So that's probably not broken down enough. So let's try doing it again. Going back to here, it does tell us tags, a comma delimited list of tags to filter the feed by. So let's just change that, and we'll break it down a little bit, and we'll put Android, comma, lollipop. So we've now got 2 tags to search by. And now we're getting something that's maybe a little bit closer. We're now talking specifically about Android 5 lollipop, as you can see in there. But just to be sure, going back again to the list here, there's also another parameter. Controls whether items must have all the tags. So in other words, do we want to return images that have been tagged with the words Android and lollipop? The default is all, which means they must have all the tags, but you can also specify any. So I'm going to leave it on all, which means they've got to have both. So I can just have one more look there. Okay, so that's just one simple way of breaking it down. So you can see that recent uploads tagged Android and lollipop, and we could put, if we really wanted to, we could put a third one in there, SDK. But eventually, if you keep breaking this down, you're going to find there'll be nothing that matches. In this case, we haven't found a recent upload that's been tagged Android, lollipop, and SDK. I could take SDK out again. We'll probably get those other ones back again, as you can see there. So obviously, the more you break it down, the less photos are going to be returned. And again, this is not all photos. This is only recent ones. Okay, so see, we've got a good start. We've got it working. But look, let's not use XML this time. We want to do something different. So let's change the format. Let's go with JSON. Now, JSON stands for JavaScript Object Notation, and essentially it's a lightweight data interchange format. So it works similarly to XML, but it's just another format, and it's very useful for data manipulation, and it's probably more readable. I think it's more readable than XML, and very easy. There's lots of programs that can process it, and indeed Android apps can process it as well. So to do that, looking back at our service API, the Feeds API, we had an option here for a format. So we can go format of the feed, click on the feeds page. It tells us a variety of XML formats. RSS is essentially XML. All of these are XML, but also PHP, JSON. So let's try this one here, this JSON one. So I'm going to go back to that, and it was format equals. Okay, then the second parameter you add has to have an ampersand. So you can see here, the first one, tags, has got a question mark because that's the first one in the list. All the subsequent ones after that have to have an ampersand before the name. Format equals JSON. And you can see now we've got a completely different format. And that's the beauty about an API that does all the hard work for you. So you can see we've now got this. And what I suggest we do, it's now that that's starting to work, I just want to talk very briefly about this, just so you sort of understand how JSON works. Anything that's in a brace like this one, left to right brace, is an object. Anything that's in a square bracket is an array. And then items that are within that are called properties. So title was a property. You can see items is an array. It's an array of items. If we scroll down and have a look, you can see how that the items are starting, and there's the actual object. That's one object there. Then there's a comma, then it starts on the next one. So these are the individual records, if you like, for each image. So it does look a little bit complex, but essentially, if you remember that analogy, that an object starting with a brace, like the round brace, and then the array is the square brace. So you can see we've got lots of items, which you would expect because each image has effectively is its own item. Then these are properties, and that's the name of the property, and this is the data sort of relating to that property as well. So you can see there, for example, tags. I talked about before looking for tags. That's the field tags that's stored with the image on Flickr, and that's what we were matching on. We were looking for the contents that were in there. So next thing to do, what I always suggest you do whenever you're dealing with this type of data, okay, we've got that right on the screen, and we can assume that Flickr is giving us valid JSON data, but it's good not to assume that. What I suggest you do is go to a site and literally copy and paste this in and be sure that it's correct. Now the reason we want to do that is we want to make sure that we're not spending hours trying to debug problems and all sorts of things in our program code only to find that the data is invalid. So I always suggest you do that first. So I'm going to copy this URL. I'm going to suggest you go to a site called jasonlint.com. And this is a site, it's a JSON validator. So basically it's really only there to help you confirm that a particular piece of code is valid. So you can either paste in the URL, which I'm going to do here, or you can paste in the actual JSON sort of data itself. So if we validate that, and not a good sign, it's in red, there's a parse error on line 1. So it's not liking this first bit here that it doesn't like. Now, I'm trying to sort of work you through a process here so you sort of understand how to sort of debug these things, because if you don't understand the process of going through and sort of figuring out this data, you're going to sort of be hitting insurmountable roadblocks. So next thing, okay, we've got an error here. So clearly this is telling us that at the moment, this JSON data is not valid. So what that means is the way that we've received the data from Flickr at the moment, for whatever reason, the format is invalid. So what would you do at this point? Well, what I would do, I wouldn't go and spend hours on the documentation because there's probably an answer there. What I'd be doing is I would be copying this little piece of code here, and I'd be going into a browser, going into Google, do it from here, paste that in, and I'm doing a search for invalid JSON. Because obviously that's what the problem is, it's invalid JSON code, and that's the identifier which hopefully will lead us to an answer. And okay, JSON Flickr feed, so they're obviously using the same thing. So let's go into this first Stack Overflow listing. Okay, just scrolling down. Okay, he's getting invalid data. Now that's interesting. Someone here has said the old web API, and that's very similar to the format we were using. We didn't use ID, but we used format equals JSON, and we also added some tags. But they're talking about using this ampersand no JSON callback equals 1. So let's try adding that. And again, what we're doing here is, we're trying to sort of figure out a way to not sort of get stuck. So that's what I've done. I've just done a simple search, and you sort of try a few things out. That's literally what we do. So we'd go back here, we'd paste that little bit on the end, and remembering what this looked like beforehand, press enter. You notice what's happened there. It's actually removed that first part. But I'm going to select all this now and just show you a different way of checking JSON lint. So I'm copying the entire XML. I'm going to paste it all into there, and now because we haven't got that JSON Flickr feed at the top, this should validate. We've now got some valid JSON. So just to make sure, we'll go back here, copy that URL, just to sort of make sure that the URL is also working. It's now got the no JSON callback equals 1. And that's also valid, as you can see. So always good practice. I always recommend, and if you're using XML, there's tools available as well to validate XML. Make sure your source data is correct before you start importing it into your code, because invariably you'll be quite frustrated spending hours trying to figure out where the issue is. And if it's all relating to the source data coming in the first place, you could have saved yourself hours of frustration. So again, always make sure the data is correct. Okay, so it's time. Now we've got our data correct. We've got our string, which we can now use in our application. Let's shoot back to, or go into Android Studio and create a new project. So I'm going to click on New Project. And I'm going to call it Flickr Browser. The domain name, I'm going to use android.example.org, but of course you'd use whatever is appropriate for yours. And that's the folder that I happen to be storing my projects in, Android Studio Projects, but obviously that would be your location that you've decided for your computer. API 16 we've talked about. We're going to use Jelly Bean 4.1 as our minimum. And you notice there's no target SDK, and that's because it defaults to the latest version we've got installed, which of course is API level 21, which is our Android Lollipop. So click on Next. Now this time I'm going to select a blank activity with fragment. We're going to use a fragment for this application, but we'll talk more about that when we get to that relevant section. Click on Next. And I'm going to leave all these names at the moment as their default, because part of the process of this is I'm going to show you how to manually rename and change things anyway. So I'm going to click on Finish. And let it create the project for the first time. Okay, so there's our default application. And firstly, what I want to do, I want to recommend you do is make sure that show lines are on. Show lines here. It's very useful for you, particularly for debugging purposes, to know the line numbers. So to do that, we go into Android Preferences, Android Studio Preferences. And you go down to Editor, select Appearance, and show line numbers. And that should be the same for Windows as well. Click on OK. You've now got line numbers here. Okay, so what we're going to do first with this application, we want to start with the basics. Before we do our JSON parsing of that data, we need to download the very basic data. So the approach of this project is going to be, we're going to get the data download all working and configured so that we know that the data is coming into the system okay. Once we've got it in a format we can work with, we're then going to tackle the interface. So we need to create a class, and I'm going to call that one, right click there, new class, get raw data. So what it's going to be doing is essentially downloading the raw data, that's sort of the unprocessed JSON data from that URL. So it won't be converting the data into any format that we can work with yet. What it will literally be doing is just downloading that data so we can process it elsewhere. And this class is going to be called from our main activity. So to start with, we're going to create what's called an enum, and we're going to have a list of download statuses. So we can actually tell calling processes whether this has succeeded or sort of what the state of the download is. This is how you create an enum, which I've been through this in the Java tutorial, so refer to that if you haven't looked at that previously. And just out of interest, there's been some talk about whether you should be using enums or sort of final ints and so forth. Don't get too caught up in some of that conversation, because there's lots of people out there with sort of very strong opinions. I personally don't try and spend any time on optimization while I'm sort of creating an app. And most people, who've been, developers for a while will tell you don't optimize, while you're developing. You try and optimize towards the end when and if it's an issue. So in other words, what I'm saying is don't try and look for, spend all this time optimizing at this early stage of your coding, because it's going to slow you down in getting a finished result, and your optimizations may not be doing, what you think they're doing anyway. So bottom line is, don't get too caught up in that. I'm using an enum, even though some people are saying that perhaps you shouldn't be using enums. A bit of conflicting opinion there if you have a look. But essentially, the download status, we're creating an enum which has got all the states that this class is going to be in, all the possibilities. So idle would mean that it's not processing anything. Processing means it's obviously at this stage downloading the data. Not initialized means that we haven't got a valid URL to download at this stage. Failed or empty means that the data that we tried to download, we either failed to download it or the data came back empty. And OK means we've got some valid data. You could obviously go into more detail and create more statuses if you wanted to, but that will work for our purposes. The first thing I want to add is a log tag. So we've got a standard way of accessing an output when we're using debug statements, using log statements. So I'm going to put something like equals the name of our class dot get simple name. And you'll see me using this later on in the process when we start using the log statement. We also need a few variables. We need to store the raw URL. And incidentally, my naming conventions, and this is fairly uniform, start with a lowercase m if it's a private variable in a class. And then it's obviously uppercase letters, sort of camel case after that. And likewise for the raw data itself. I'm just going to call that data and private, and we need the download status, of course, because we've already defined the possibilities. We're going to call that mDownload status. We now need to add a constructor. So thinking about it, how will people initialize this? Well, to me, the obvious thing would be they would be sending the URL that we want to get the data from. So we want to create a public constructor. And just incidentally, there's another way of doing that. We can hold down Command N to create a constructor, and I believe it's Control N if you're on Windows. And then it'll ask which pieces of data do you want to collect. I'm going to select that raw data. Now that raw data was actually a typo, that was meant to be URL, but that brings me to show you how easy it is to change. You can right click, refactor, rename, or I could have, you can see there I can press Shift F6, it shows you as the shortcut. And I've changed that should have been URL. You can see as I'm typing, it's actually changing it in two places. And it's also going to come up and said, look, do you want to rename the parameter? Because technically that's now wrong. So we could change it too if we wanted to. So it's very nice. This is the IDE doing a lot of that work for us. And there's our constructor. So that's good. We've got our raw URL done. Okay, at this point I'm going to stop the video. We're getting, time is really moving on, and we'll continue this in the next video.